Welcome to Battle Cry, where the blood, grit, and sacrifice of American warriors echo through the fiercest battles in American military history. From the first musket fired at Lexington to the firefights of Fallujah, we relive the turning points that shaped our freedom and incite patriotism. Stand tall, stand proud. The story begins now.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack complex topics and really distill them down to what matters most for you.
Glad to be here.
So today we are diving deep into a really pivotal moment in American history. The battles of Saratoga in 1777.
Yeah, absolutely pivotal.
And this wasn't, just another battle. It was a massive turning point in the Revolutionary War. It's packed with tactical genius, sure, but also these intense personal rivalries and some, frankly, surprising human stories that you don't always hear about.
Right. And to really get into that, to sort of peel back the layers of myth around Saratoga, we've gathered, well, quite a range of sources.
Okay.
We've got the detailed historical reports, naturally, but also contemporary letters, written right there near the action, and these incredibly vivid personal diaries, camp followers, for instance.
Right, the civilians, wives, families who are actually with the Army.
Exactly, providing all those essential services, plus, of course, modern analyses that help tie it all together. These sources, they give us a much richer, much more complex picture than the standard history.
Absolutely. So our mission for this deep dive isn't just to recount the events, is it?
No, not at all.
We want to really unpack the key players, look at those unexpected twists, and understand the implications, the big picture, that made Saratoga what people at the time called the completest victory for the Americans.
And a complete disaster for the British.
Right, a disaster that fundamentally changed the course of the Revolution. Okay, let's unpack this. Where should we start? Maybe with the British plan? Burgoyne's grand design?
Sounds like a good place. Early 1777.
Yeah, so early 1777. To really get this turning point, you need this setup, right? The British had this, well, seemingly grand plan, very confident.
Overconfident, maybe.
Definitely overconfident.
Yeah.
Crush the rebellion by splitting the colonies, drive south from Canada. General John Burgoyne's leading the charge, and he takes Fort Ticonderoga so easily. King George III apparently bursts into his wife's rooms waving the message.
Right, famously shouting, "I have beat them. I have beat the Americans."
Yeah. He even bet a load of money he'd be back victorious within a year. Seems like King George might have been celebrating a bit early.
Precisely, a classic case of counting your chickens before they hatch, or, well, rebels before they're crushed.
Right.
And those premature celebrations, they actually highlight something fundamental about war back then. The tyranny of distance.
3,000 miles.
3,000 miles between London making decisions and commanders trying to execute them in America. It constantly undermined London's strategy.
Okay.
So Burgoyne's plan, it lacked, well, any real coherent link with General Howe's clan. Howe was supposed to come up from New York.
But he didn't. He went to Philadelphia instead.
Exactly. Total confusion. Crossed orders. Burgoyne was basically operating in a strategic vacuum, and he himself was wildly overconfident. He expected huge loyalist support, logistical help. It just didn't happen. Now, he later claimed his orders gave him no choice but to push on to Albany, even when, everything suggested retreat.
And he had all those heavy guns, didn't he?
Oh, yes. 138 cannons, meant for sieges. Totally cumbersome, completely wrong for the kind of campaign it turned into.
So it sounds like the plan was already shaky, strategically speaking. But then there was this other factor, unforeseen, that really sealed Burgoyne's fate on the American side, the militia.
The militia buildup, yes.
Yeah.
Critically important.
You have events like the American win at Bennington,
Yeah.
General Stark capturing nearly 500 German soldiers. That cost Burgoyne about 1,000 men.
Devastating loss for him, yeah. Both men and supplies.
And then, critically, the whole Jane McCrea incident, the story of her being killed by Native Americans allied with Burgoyne. That caused widespread outrage.
Huge outrage. It was published everywhere, and it fueled this massive outpouring of militia, as historians call it. It really transformed the American force facing Burgoyne.
So the militia wasn't just growing, it was getting fired up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Motivated. Bennington showed they could win. Jane McCrea gave them a powerful reason to fight. And you mentioned the Native Americans with Burgoyne.
Yeah, what was their role exactly?
Primarily scouting, reconnaissance, screening the Army's movements, some raiding. But let's say their way of war was fundamentally different from the European style.
Right.
Incidents like Jane McCrea's death, and look, the exact details are debated even in contemporary sources, but the perception was of indiscriminate violence. Didn't matter if you were patriot or loyalist. And that drove militia, people wanting revenge, wanting protection, straight into Gates's army, swelled his numbers significantly, changed the whole balance.
Okay, so Burgoyne's army is kind of stumbling south, problems mounting. Let's shift focus to the Americans, their defensive setup. Horatio Gates takes command from Philip Schuyler.
Right. August 19th, Schuyler was out, partly political fallout from losing Ticonderoga.
And Gates sets up strong defenses at Bemis Heights, south of Stillwater. His idea was clearly defensive, hold the line, but was everyone on board with that?
That is an excellent question,
Yeah.
because no, not everyone was on board. Gates's defensive plan was, well, pretty much the opposite of what Benedict Arnold wanted.
Arnold.
Yeah. Arnold was, a very experienced, very aggressive field commander, daring. He believed they needed to take the fight to the British, commit troops out in the woods, north of the lines, don't even let the British get close enough to contest their fortifications.
So right away, you've got a clash in strategy. And personality, presumably.
Well, definitely personality, too. And that clash leads us straight into the First Battle of Saratoga, Freeman's Farm, September 19th, 1777.
A British advance. 3 columns. They're expecting to break through, right?
They are, but they run into fierce, unexpected resistance. Colonel Daniel Morgan's riflemen.
Legendary sharpshooter.
Absolutely. And Major Henry Dearborn's musketmen. They basically ambush the British advance guard.
And Morgan's riflemen, they were particularly effective against.
The British gunners. They could pick them off with incredible accuracy. It really neutralized the British artillery advantage, which was significant. The Americans, they held off the British all afternoon. Quite something for this, relatively new army.
And the fighting only stopped when?
At dusk. General von Riedesel's German troops arrived just in time to stabilize the British line. For the British, though, this was what you'd call a Pyrrhic victory.
They held the ground, but the cost.
Exactly. The cost in men was huge, something they just couldn't afford, especially being so far from reinforcements and supplies.
Okay, here's where it gets, as you said earlier, really interesting. The immediate aftermath. You have sources like Robert Livingston, Richard Varick. They're crediting Arnold, saying he was the one who stopped Burgoyne. His direction was solely responsible.
Yeah, strong praise.
But then Gates sends this official report to Congress, and Arnold's name is just gone, not mentioned at all. How does that happen? How do you erase the guy credited with the success?
Well, that omission, as you can probably guess, it absolutely lit the fuse. The conflict between Gates and Arnold just escalated dramatically after that.
Arnold must have been furious.
Furious is probably an understatement. He felt slighted, passed over for promotion again. He openly accused Gates of being jealous, especially because Gates was suddenly being hailed as the hero of Saratoga.
So it wasn't just hurt pride. It exposed a real problem in the command structure.
A deep flaw, yeah. Personal rivalries, potentially sidelining your best battlefield commanders. Not ideal.
And did they confront each other directly?
Oh, yes. Very directly. Arnold writes this long letter to Gates, lists all his grievances, my proposals were rejected, my orders were ignored, you treated me with greatest coolness.
And Gates's response?
Dismissive, completely dismissive. Reportedly told Arnold he was, quote, of little consequence to the army, and that Gates would, quote, with all my heart give me a pass whenever I thought proper to go to Philadelphia.
Wow. Basically telling him to get lost, go home.
Pretty much. A total repudiation.
But Arnold did have allies, right? People who saw his value.
He certainly did. Powerful ones, too. Robert R. Livingston, writing under Arnold's direction, basically strongly recommended Arnold's conduct. Gave him a full share of the honor for the battle on the 19th.
And Henry Brockholst Livingston, Schuyler's aide, then Arnold's.
Right. He wrote to Schuyler saying Arnold's reaction to being ignored was immediate and violent. Called Arnold the life and soul of the troops. Stated flat out, to him and to him alone is due the honor of our late victory.
Strong words.
Very strong. And Varick backed this up. Said Gates treated Arnold with insufferable rudeness. Seemed piqued, annoyed, basically that Arnold's division got the glory. So yeah, there was a widespread feeling Arnold got shafted.
Which brings up this interesting point about command styles, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This whole differing philosophy on battlefield command, you have the romantic conception, right? The commander leading the charge, sword in hand.
Which might make Gates look less heroic staying back at headquarters.
Exactly. But strategically, the reality is the Army commander needs to direct the whole show. They need to be where they can get information, send orders, where subordinates can find them.
Like Washington often did.
Precisely. Washington was brave, no question. But he usually directed from a position where he could see the bigger picture. Getting stuck in the front line, it limits your perspective, limits your ability to command the whole army.
Whereas Burgoyne often got personally involved.
He did, and arguably it limited his effectiveness as the overall commander. It also makes you wonder, how much Gates distrusted Livingston's complaints, given their history with Stuyler.
The political dimension again.
Right. And Arnold, he was close to the younger officers. Maybe their criticisms influenced him, turning what might have been a manageable disagreement into this complete breakdown with Gates.
It really makes you think how much of history turns on these personal clashes, these bruised egos.
It truly does. So tensions are sky high, Gates and Arnold. Relationship shattered. Which brings us to the Second Battle of Saratoga, October 7th, 1777.
And Burgoyne is getting desperate by this point.
Extremely desperate. Supplies are running out. No sign of reinforcement from General Clinton down in New York. He makes one last desperate gamble, sends out a reconnaissance force, attack the American left flank, Bemis Heights again, hoping to find a weak spot.
But the Americans were ready for them this time.
Oh, yes. Ready and in much greater numbers. About 13,000 Americans to Burgoyne's roughly 4,400 remaining regulars. They counterattacked, and it was devastating.
General Enoch Poor's brigade.
Drove back the British grenadiers, yeah. Morgan's men hit the British right flank. General Simon Fraser, a really key British commander, was mortally wounded.
That's the famous story, isn't it? Often credited to one of Morgan's men, Timothy Murphy.
That's the story, though like many of these details, some sources debate the exact historical accuracy. But Fraser's loss was a huge blow. Burgoyne himself nearly bought it. 3 shots hit his horse, his hat, his waistcoat. Close call.
And then there's Arnold, his incredible, controversial, legendary role in this battle. He'd been officially relieved of command by Gates, right?
Officially, yes. The feud had reached that point. But Arnold, he couldn't stay away. He reportedly just rode out recklessly between the lines, like a whirlwind of fury and courage.
Leading troops he wasn't supposed to be leading.
Exactly. He led Poor's men in this incredibly costly, ultimately futile attack on the Belcaires Redoubt. That was a strong, well-defended British position. It held firm.
But he didn't give up.
No. He shifted focus to the Bremen Redoubt, another fortified position held mainly by German troops.
And this is where the breakthrough happened.
This was the climax of the battle, yes. Arnold led the charge. They found a way to expose the redoubt's rear. There was furious battle, just brutal close-quarters fighting, and the redoubt fell.
Which
meant Burgoyne's entire position was now untenable, completely compromised, game over, essentially.
And in that chaos, the German commander, Bremen...
Lieutenant Heinrich von Bremen, yeah. In a fit of rage, apparently hacked down some of his own men who were retreating, and then he himself was killed. Some accounts say by one of his own soldiers, others say by Americans. It was chaos.
And Arnold. What happened to him in that final charge?
His horse was shot from under him. As it fell, he was shot in the same leg that had been wounded earlier at Quebec. The leg was shattered by the bullet in the falling horse.
Just incredible bravery, but also recklessness.
Absolutely. And in that moment, wounded, victory achieved, but at great personal cost, he reportedly said he wished he'd been shot through the heart to die right there, a heroic martyr.
Wow. A tragic sort of premonition, given what came later.
Indeed.
So the battle's over, Bremen Redoubt falls. What was the immediate aftermath like for Burgoyne's army?
Grim. Just absolutely grim. Heavy rain started, turned cold. Their retreat north slowed to a crawl, and within just 2 days, Gates's soldiers had them completely surrounded near Saratoga.
Supplies gone.
Fast consuming their food, as one source puts it, wounded men suffering terribly. And the soldiers were exposed to these just macabre sights. Shallow graves disturbed by animals, the howling of wolves drawn by the dead. It paints a really bleak picture.
It really does. And we have personal accounts from this time too, don't we?
Yeah.
Like Baroness von Riedel.
Yes, Friederike von Riedel, wife of the German commander. Her diary is incredible, vivid. She describes cannon fire hitting the house they were sheltering, and the Americans thought it was headquarters.
Terrifying.
She talks about throwing her children into the bottom of their carriage, the calash, and throwing herself on top of them for protection, hiding in a cellar with the wounded, enduring this abominable smell, the cries of the children, and my own anguish.
Unimaginable.
And yet, amidst all that horror, she apparently still had the presence of mind to confront Burgoyne about the conditions, noted his social habits, spending nights singing and drinking while the army fell apart quite bold.
And there's Lady Harriet Ackland too, right? Another aristocratic woman caught up in this.
Yes, another incredible story. She followed her husband, Major John Dyke Ackland, on a campaign, nursed him through illnesses, even severe burns when their tent caught fire once. Then, after he was wounded again in the fighting and left behind at a British hospital during the retreat, she risked everything, her life, her freedom, crossed the lines under a flag of truce to nurse him while he was a prisoner of the Americans.
These stories, they really bring home the human cost, don't they? It's not just armies and generals.
Exactly. These are real people enduring unbelievable hardship and showing incredible courage.
So Burgoyne is surrounded, outnumbered massively now. What happens next?
Well, the writing's on the wall. His army is down to about 5,800 men. The Americans have maybe 12,000, 13,000 surrounding them. On October 13th, Burgoyne asks for terms.
Does Gates demand unconditional surrender?
Initially, yes, that was his first demand. But after a couple of days of negotiation, surprisingly, he agrees to more lenient terms. October 15th. It becomes known as the Convention of Saratoga.
The convention. And what did that entail?
It allowed the British troops to march out with the honors of war, stack their arms, and then return to England. The key condition, though, was that they promised not to fight again in the war against America.
So they weren't technically prisoners of war in the usual sense.
Sort of. It was a bit ambiguous and actually caused problems later when Congress didn't fully trust the agreement, but that was the deal struck on the ground.
And the spoils for the Americans, what did they gain?
It was immense. You had 3,400 British soldiers, 2,500 Hessians, German auxiliaries, and around 600 women and children, the camp followers who surrendered, plus a huge amount of equipment. 37 cannons and mortars, nearly 5,000 muskets, 72,000 cartridges. A massive haul.
And the famous image of the surrender, Burgoyne offering his sword.
Yes, the symbolic moment. Burgoyne, dressed immaculately apparently, offers his sword to Gates. Gates, equally formally, accepts the surrender but refuses to take the sword. A gesture of respect, maybe, or just protocol.
So Saratoga, the surrender happens. What is the immediate and maybe the long-term significance? Why is it such a turning point?
Well, militarily, it was huge, obviously. An entire British army wiped off from the map. But the profound significance, the reason it's called a great turning point of the war, is geopolitical.
Foreign assistance.
Exactly. This decisive American victory was the proof the French government needed. It convinced them that the Americans actually had a chance of winning. And that persuaded France to formally enter the war as an American ally in 1778.
Which changed everything.
Completely changed the game. Brought in French money, French troops, and crucially, the French Navy. It turned a colonial rebellion into a global conflict, stretching British resources thin. Saratoga unlocked that door.
Okay, let's bring Benedict Arnold back into this. We left him wounded, hailed by some, ignored by Gates. But Saratoga, despite the victory, clearly left scars on him.
Deep scars. It's crucial to remember, even though George Washington himself later stepped in and sorted out Arnold's rank dispute, rectified Arnold's squabble over rank, as one historian puts it, those slights at Saratoga, that feeling of injustice, being denied credit by Gates, it festered.
It fueled that sense of grievance, didn't it? That alienation.
Absolutely. It built up over time, and it tragically culminated, well, first with his marriage in 1779 to Peggy Shippen.
From a prominent Loyalist family in Philadelphia.
Right. And that connection might have further pushed him towards abandoning the patriot cause he'd fought so bravely for.
Leading to 1780, the betrayal.
1780. He defects, offers to hand over the critical American fort at West Point to the British for 20,000 pounds.
An enormous sum.
A fortune. It's just the ultimate fall from grace, from the hero of Saratoga, or one of them at least, to America's most infamous traitor.
And it's one of history's huge what-ifs, isn't it?
Yeah.
If his plot had actually succeeded.
Oh, absolutely. If the British had gained control of West Point, they'd have controlled the Hudson River Valley, could have split New England off, potentially changed the whole outcome of the war. Hugely consequential.
But the plot was discovered. Arnold escaped.
Escaped capture and trial, yes. Served as a brigadier general in the British Army, actually led raids against American targets, eventually ended up living in London, never really trusted by either side again, arguably.
So when we look back at Saratoga, what's the big takeaway? What does it all mean?
Well, what's really fascinating, I think, is that Saratoga isn't just about troops moving on a map or who had more guns. It's such a vivid example of how leadership, good and bad, how individual personalities, those rivalries we talked about.
Right, the Gates-Arnold feud.
Exactly. And the brutal realities of logistics, supplying an army far from home. even public opinion, like the reaction to Jane McCrae. All these things can dramatically alter the course of history.
So the grand strategies are important, but they can be completely undone by these very human factors.
Precisely. Personal loyalty, personal grievance, chance events. They shape outcomes in ways no one could have predicted.
Which leaves us with a final thought perhaps for you listening. Consider how these pivotal moments, the ones we often see just through that lens of grand strategy, how profoundly they're actually shaped by clashing personalities, by the very real, very human cost of war, by the shifting loyalties of individuals. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, what other heroes in history might have become traitors under different circumstances, or maybe even the other way around.
Something to definitely ponder.
Indeed. Something to think about until our next deep dive.
You have been listening to Battle Cry. Join us again next time.